Hello and welcome to the next edition of the Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Transformation Interview Series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT transformation and innovation and how it's making an impact on people's lives. Our next thought leadership discussion focuses on the burgeoning trends around DevOps and how that's translating into new types of infrastructure and how developers as well as operators can take advantage of that. To learn more about trends and developments in DevOps, microservices, containers, and the new direction for composable infrastructure, we're joined by Donnie Berkholz, Research Director at 451 Research, and he's based in Minneapolis. Welcome to BriefingsDirect, Donnie.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start at the high end and work our way down. Why are things changing so much for infrastructure? Why is DevOps such a buzzword for the development, and why are we looking for different types of infrastructure, this new composable word coming out a lot? Why the need for such abrupt change? Everything seems to be moving at once.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple of big drivers behind it. One of them is cloud, really probably the biggest one because of the scale that we have to deal with now, the transients that we have to deal with now with VMs appearing and disappearing on such a rapid basis. We have to have software and processes and cultures that support that kind of new approach. And IT is getting more and more demands for scale, more and more demands to do more from the line of business. And they're not getting more money and they're not getting more people. And so they have to figure out what's the right approach to deal with this. How can we scale and how can we do more and how can we be more agile? And DevOps is the approach that's been settled on. And one of the big reasons behind that is the automation. That's one of what I think of as the three pillars of DevOps, which are culture, automation, and measurement. And that automation is what lets you move from this metaphor of cattle versus pets, right? Moving from the pet side of it, where you carefully name and handcraft each server, to a cattle mindset, where you're thinking about fleets of servers and about services rather than individual servers, VMs, containers, or what have you, so that you can have sysadmins who might be maintaining 10,000 virtual machines rather than 100, maybe 150 servers by hand. That's what the automation gets you. And so, you're doing more with less. And then, as I said, they're also getting demands from the business to be more agile, deliver faster, right? Because the businesses all want to compete with the companies like the Netflixes or Zenefits or, take your pick, the Teslas of the world, these software-defined organizations. And how can they be more agile? How can they become competitive if you're a big insurance company or a big bank? And DevOps is one of the key approaches behind that, right? You get the automation, and you get the automation not just on the server side, but the automation on the application delivery pipeline, which is really a critical aspect of it, so that you're moving toward this continuous delivery approach and able to move a step beyond Agile to bring Agile all the way through to production and to deploy software maybe even on every commit, which is the far end of DevOps. There's a lot of organizations that aren't there yet, but they're taking steps toward that, toward moving from deployments every 3 months or 6 months to every few weeks perhaps.
So the vision of having that constant iterative process, continuous development, continuous test, continuous deployment, at the same time, being able to take advantage of these new cloud models is still kind of a tricky equation for people to work out. What is it that we need to put in place that allows us to be agile as a development organization and be automated and orchestrated as an operations organization? How can we make that happen practically now that we all pretty much agree that this is the way that things should go?
Yeah, I think it always goes back to three things: people, process, technology. And from the people perspective, what I run into is there's a lot of organizations who have either development or operational groups where some of them just can't make this transition. They can't start thinking about the business impacts of what they're doing. They're focused on keeping the lights on, maintaining the servers, writing the code, and being able to make that transition to focusing on what does the business need? How am I helping the company is the critical step from an individual level, but also from an organizational level, right? IT is going through this kind of existential crisis of, moving from being a cost center to fighting shadow IT, fighting bring your own device, trying to figure out how do we bring that all into the fold. And how they do so is this transition toward IT as a service is the way we think about it. IT becoming more like a service provider in their own right, pulling in all these external services and providing a better experience in-house. Because if you think about shadow IT, for example, you think about developers going and using a credit card to sign up for some public cloud or another. And that's all well and good, but wouldn't it be even nicer if they didn't have to worry about the billing and the expensing and the payments and all that stuff because IT already provided that for them? That's where things are going, is that sort of IT as a service provider model.
People, process, technology, existential issues. The vendors are also facing existential issues, things changing so fast, and they provide technology. The people in the process, of course, are up to the enterprise to figure out what is happening on the technology side and how are the vendors reacting to allow enterprises to then employ the people and put in place the processes that will bring us to this better DevOps automated reality. What can we put in place technically to make this possible?
Right, good question. And I think it goes back to two approaches, one coming in from a development side and one coming in from an operational side. From a development side, we're talking about things like continuous delivery pipelines, right? What does the application delivery process look like? And typically you would start with something like continuous integration, right? So just moving toward an automated testing environment such that every commit you make, you're testing the code base against it one way or another. And this is a big transition for people to make, especially as you think about moving the next step to continuous delivery, which is not just testing the code base, but testing the full environment and being ready to potentially deploy that to production with every commit, or perhaps on a daily basis. And so that continuous integration, continuous delivery approach, using CI servers, there's a pretty well-known open source one called Jenkins. There's many other examples of as-a-service options or on-prem options. That tends to be step one if you're coming in from the development side. Now, automation on the operational side is much more about infrastructure as code is really the core tenet. And this is embodied by configuration management software like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Salt, maybe CF Engine. And the approach is defining server configuration in code and maintaining it in version control, just like you would maintain the software that you're building in version control, such that you can scale it easily because you know exactly how a server is created. You can say, is that one mail server? Is it 20? It doesn't really matter. I'm just running the same code again to deploy a new virtual machine or to deploy onto a bare metal environment or to deploy a new container. It's all about that infrastructure as code approach using configuration management tools. And when you bring those two things together, that's what enables you to really do continuous delivery, right? You've got the automated application delivery pipeline on the top, and you've got the automated server environment on the bottom. And then in the middle, you've got things like service virtualization, data virtualization, continuous integration servers, all letting you have an extremely reliable and reproducible and scalable environment that is the same all the way from development to production.
And when we go to infrastructure as code, when we go to software-based everything, there's a challenge getting there, but there's also some major paybacks. When you're freed up to analyze your software, when you can replicate things rapidly, when you can deploy to a cloud model that works for your economic or security requirements, you get a lot of benefits. Are we seeing those yet, Donnie? Are people still at the point where this is if you build it, they will come, and we think it's going to be good, or are there demonstrable benefits of being software driven as an organization, top to bottom?
I think one of the challenges is that we know there are benefits, but they're very challenging to quantify. When you talk about what is the benefit of delivering a solution to market faster than your competitors, the benefit is you're still in business, right? The benefit is you're Netflix and you're not Blockbuster. The benefit is, you're Tesla and you're not, one of the big 3 car manufacturers. You're shipping updates. I mean, Tesla, for example, just shipped an update to its cars that let them self-drive on the fly for people who had already purchased the car. You can't really quantify the value of that easily. What you can quantify is natural selection in action, right? There's no mandatory requirement that any company survive, that any company can make the transition to software defined. But if you want to survive, you're going to have to take this kind of DevOps mindset so that you can be more agile, not just as a software group, but as a business.
Perhaps one of the ways we can measure this is we used to look at IT spend as a percentage of capital spend for an enterprise. And many organizations over the past 20 or 30 years found themselves spending 50% or more of their capital expenditures on IT. I think they'd like to ratchet that back. If we go to IT as a service, if we pay for things at an operations level, if we only pay for what we use, shouldn't we start to see a fairly significant decrease in the total IT spend versus revenue or profit for most organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the one underlying factor there that I want to answer is how important is software to your company? And if that importance is growing, you're probably going to spend more as a percentage, but you're going to be generating more margin as a result of that. And I think that's one of the big transitions happening is the move from IT as a cost center to IT as a collaborator with the business, right? The move from your traditional old CIO view of we're going to keep the lights on to they're fighting with, a lot of companies are bringing in chief digital officers, for example, because the CIO wasn't taking this collaborative business view. And so they're either making the transition or they're getting left behind. And so, I think we'll actually see IT spend increase as a percentage because companies are all realizing that in actuality, they are software companies or they're becoming software companies. But like I said, they're going to be generating a lot more value on top of that spend. And I think to your point about OpEx and buying things as a service, the piece of advice I always give to companies is saying, look, how many of these things you're doing are significant differentiators for your company? Is it really a differentiator for your company to be an expert at automating a delivery pipeline, to be an expert at automating your servers, to be an expert at setting up file sharing, to be an expert at setting up an internal chat server? None of those, right? Why not outsource them to people who are experts in it, to people who do generate that as their core differentiator and their core value creator, and focus on the things that your business cares about instead?
All right, let's get back to this infrastructure equation. We're hearing about composable infrastructure, software-defined data center, microservices, containers, and of course, hybrid cloud or hybrid computing. If I'm looking to improve my business agility, where do I look to in terms of understanding my future infrastructure partners, right? Is my IT organization just a broker, and are they going to work with other brokers? Are we looking at a hierarchy of brokering with some sort of a baseline commoditized set of services underneath? And so where do we go in terms of knowing who the preferred vendors are? I guess we're sort of looking at a time when no one got fired for buying IBM, for example. Everyone's saying Amazon's going to take over the world, but I've heard that about other vendors in the past, and it didn't pan out. This is a roundabout way of saying when you want to compose infrastructure, how do you keep choice? How do you keep from getting locked in? How do you find a way to be in a market at all times?
Right. Good question. I think composability is really key. We see a lot of IT organizations. They used to, like you said, they used to just buy blue, for example, right? They were IBM shops. And that's no longer a thing in the way that it used to be, right? There's a lot more fragmentation in terms of technology, programming languages, hardware, JavaScript toolkits, databases. Everything is becoming polyglot and heterogeneous. And the only way to cope with that is to really focus on composability, right? Focus on multi-vendor solutions, focus on openness, right? Open APIs and open source as well are incredibly important in this composable world because everything has to be able to piece together. But the problem is when you give traditional enterprises a bunch of pieces, it's like having kids just create a huge mess on the floor, right? Like where do you even get started? And that's one of the challenges they need to have is the way I always think about it is, what enterprises are looking for, they're looking for a Lego castle, right? They don't want the Lego pieces, and they don't want, like that scene in the Lego movie where the father glues all the blocks together. They don't want it to be stuck, right? That's the old monolithic world. The new composable world is you get that castle, and you can take off a tower and put in a new tower if you want to, right? But you're not given just the pieces. You're given not just something that is composable, but something that is pre-composed for you, for your use case, so that it generates value and looks like we used to think about reference architectures, for example, being something sitting on a PowerPoint slide, some kind of fancy diagram. It's moving more toward reference architectures in the form of code, right? Saying, here is a piece of code that's ready to deploy, and that's enabled through things like infrastructure as code.
Or a set of APIs.
Exactly. It's enabled by having all of that stuff ready to go, ready to build in a way that wasn't possible before, right? Like the best case scenario before was, hey, here's a virtual appliance, have fun with that, right? Whereas now you can distribute the code and they can roll that up, they can customize it, they can take a piece out, put a piece in however they want to.
All right, before we close out, Donnie, any words of advice for organizations back to that cultural issue? Probably the more difficult one, really. You have a lot of choices of technology, but how to actually change the way people think and behave among each other is always difficult. DevOps leading to composable infrastructure, leading to this sort of services brokering economy, for lack of a better word, or marketplace perhaps. What are you telling people about how to make that cultural shift? How do organizations change while still keeping the airplane flying, so to speak?
Right. I think you can't do it as a big bang. That is absolutely the worst possible way to go about it. And if you think about change management, it's a pretty well-studied discipline at this point. There's an approach I prefer from a guy named John Cotter, who's written books and books about change management. And in them, he lays out like an 8 or 9 step process of how you make these changes happen. And the funny thing about it is actually doing the change is one of the last steps, right? So much of it is about building buy-in, about generating small wins, about starting, let's say, with an independent team and saying, hey, we're going to take, let's say, the mobile apps team, and we're going to try out continuous delivery over there. We're not going to stop doing everything for 6 months as we try and roll this out across the organization, because the business isn't going to stand for that. They're going to say, like, what are you doing over there? You're not even shipping anything. What are you messing around with, right? So you've got to go piece by piece. Let's say start by rolling out continuous integration, slowly adding more and more automated tests to it, while keeping the manual testers alongside, so that you're not dropping all of the quality that you had before. You're actually adding more quality by adding the automation and slowly converting those manual testers over to the engineers and test. And so that's the key to it, right? Generate small wins and start small, and then gradually work your way up as you're able to prove the value to the organization, and make sure while you're doing so that you have executive buy-in. Because the tools side of things, you can start at a pretty small level, but thinking about reorganization and cultural change, if you don't have executive buy-in, that's never going to fly.
And perhaps that executive buy-in includes thinking of yourself as a software organization.
Absolutely.
Well, good. Let's leave it there. We've been exploring the new ways that DevOps and automation and orchestration are coming together for continuous delivery and composable infrastructure. And we've been joined by Donnie Berkholz. He's Research Director at 451 Research, and he's based in Minneapolis. Thanks so much, Donnie.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to our audience as well for joining this Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Transformation and Innovation interview. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HPE-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening, and come back next time.